What happens when a quiet payroll guy is the only reason 12,000 construction workers get paid on time, but management decides he is replaceable because a new MBA niece loves Excel? What if the man they call boring and old is the only one who understands the union rules, state laws, and systems behind their paychecks? How do things break when the person they humiliate decides to follow the contract instead of saving them? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My name is Daniel, and for 8 years my life has been numbers, dust, and other people's rent money. People hear the word payroll and think of some quiet office man pressing a button once a week. They do not see the calls at 4 in the morning from a site foreman who says that his crew did 16 hours overnight and needs those hours counted right, or the union rep who says that a contract changed one line about travel pay and now 400 guys will be short if I miss it. My days start early because concrete pours and road closures start early. By 6:30 most mornings, I am already in the office, sitting at my corner desk on the open plan floor, the first person near the payroll printer. I always start the same way. I open the error logs from the overnight batch. We run test exports through my system, then into the company's big software. If there is a mismatch, the log shows me the job number and the union local. That morning, a Thursday, there was a cluster of red warning lines tied to one massive highway project. It was 3 different crews in 2 states with night shift overtime and travel hours mixed together. If I let the batch run without fixing it, hundreds of workers would get short checks, and we would spend the next week arguing with angry people who were right to be angry. I took a sip of my coffee, pulled up my own system, and started matching hours, job codes, and locals. My system lives on a gray box under my desk and on a mirror drive in my garage. When people make fun of me for that, I never explain that this old habit saved them more times than I can count. The room slowly filled with the usual low noise of keyboards and cheap chairs. People said good morning in a lazy way. I nodded back without looking up, because if I break focus in the middle of a big batch, I lose the pattern. After an hour, I fixed the error and reran the batch. The red lines turned green. It meant that the bridge crew in State A would get their night differential, the concrete guys in State B would get their travel time, and the electricians would not call the union office asking why their pension hours were short. To most people here, they were just lines in a system. To me, they were people I used to stand next to in the rain. At 9, I printed out a summary for my own records and filed it in my drawer. That was when the change in the air began. I heard the sharp sound of heels coming down the aisle. You learn to hear certain steps. These steps belonged to Taylor, the new special projects manager. She was my boss, Mark's niece, 27 years old, bright eyes, loud voice, always with a tablet in her hand. She walked like the whole floor was a stage and we were the background actors. She stopped at the end of the payroll row and twisted her mouth like she smelled something. Then she started asking questions in that tone that is not really questions. She said it seemed silly that we still used all these different screens. She said that in her last case study they ran full payroll for a major employer in one big Excel workbook that any smart person could understand. She said that we should be able to see everything on one dashboard, and she moved behind my chair without asking. I slid a little to the side so she could look at my monitor. On the screen there were job codes, local numbers, state tax tables, and a side window with my own notes. She made a small sound, like a laugh she did not finish. She said my layout looked like a basement project from the 90s. I told her, in a calm voice, that this layout let me handle union contracts across 4 states and 12,000 workers, and that it had passed every audit. She waved her tablet and said that the future could not depend on one man's garage system. She said that if I got hit by a bus, we would all be in trouble. I did not say what I was thinking, which was that the bus I feared most was a new shiny degree that did not respect the people on the ground. I just said that my notes were there for anyone who wanted to learn them. She did not listen. She walked away, telling one of the accounting guys that she would clean this up soon. A few hours later, I left the office to visit a site trailer at the big highway project that had shown up in the error logs. The trailer smelled like coffee, diesel, and wet jackets. Foremen pushed in and out, checking schedules and talking over each other. One of them, a thick-set man in his 50s named Ray, clapped me on the shoulder and said the overnight hours came through perfect this time. He said his crew could stop worrying about short checks. He never talks soft, but his thanks is always real. That kind of moment is the only reason a man like me stays late, fixes things nobody sees, and answers angry calls without yelling back. On the drive back, I thought about the difference between that trailer and my office. Out here, nobody cares if I have an MBA or if my system looks pretty. They care if the hours are right. Back in the headquarters parking lot, I sat in my truck for a minute and watched the glass front of the building. If you stand far enough, you can see your own reflection mixed with the mirrored surface. You look almost like a ghost inside the office before you walk through the door. Sometimes that is how being payroll feels. People blame you when things break and forget you when things work. I went back in and found a calendar invite on my screen for the afternoon. It was from Mark's assistant, a quick touch base in the Vendor Summit Hotel ballroom. The subject line said something about innovation panel. I sighed and clicked accept. I already knew what that meant, standing next to people who wanted to talk about innovation more than about results. That afternoon, I stood at the side of the hotel ballroom near a high table with a sweating glass of water. The room was full of executives from our company, some general contractors, a few city people, and some vendors. There were banners about safety and sustainability, which always show up when someone wants photos for a newsletter. Mark stood up front with Taylor and another VP. He introduced Taylor in a proud uncle voice, talking about her fresh perspective and her graduate degree. She smiled into the room like she owned it. When it was her turn to speak, she opened a slide deck with bright colors and clean charts. She talked about streamlining back-office functions, consolidating roles, and moving away from legacy bottlenecks. She made a small, sweeping motion toward our side of the room and said that for years, certain processes had relied on one person in a corner with a private system. She said it was too risky to have tribal knowledge that only one person held. People around me followed her hand and looked at me without moving their heads, just their eyes. A few of them smiled like it was a joke we were all in on. She said that her goal was a world where, if someone like that left or retired, the company would not even feel it. She said any smart analyst with Excel could push the same buttons. She never said my name. She did not need to. I have been the only one sitting in that payroll corner for 8 years. I have been the man who gets called when a city inspector threatens to shut down a job over unpaid fringes. I have been the one who knows that Local 312 wants their pension reported one way and Local 502 wants it another way. But in that moment, I was a shadow near the wall while people nodded at the brave new world on the screen. Mark did not correct her. He did not remind anyone that for 8 years we had passed audits and serious incidents with my tribal knowledge. He laughed when she joked that she could do it all in Excel if someone just handed her the raw data. He told the room that he was excited to see long-term silos finally break down. One of the general contractor reps, a man I had helped more than once when his crews were short, glanced at me with a sorry look, then looked away fast. The air in the room felt thick. I stayed where I was. There is a trick to surviving humiliation. You let it pass through you, like wind through scaffolding. You notice every piece, every word, but you do not let your face show it. You file it under a new label in your mind. The label might be, "Remember this later." After the panel, people gathered in small circles. Taylor held court near the front, talking about dashboards and predictive analytics. Mark stood beside her, smiling and shaking hands. I picked up my folder of vendor rate sheets and walked out quietly. Nobody stopped me for a chat. Back at the office, I went straight to my desk. The hum of printers and low talk washed over me. I set down the folder and opened my email. There was a new invite from Mark's assistant. It was for the next morning, before lunch. The subject line read, "Role alignment." That is the kind of phrase that never means good news for a man in his late 40s. I leaned back in my chair and looked across the floor. Through the front glass, I could see Mark in his office with Taylor. They stood close to each other, both looking at his monitor. Mark's hand moved as if he was pointing at something. Taylor crossed her arms and tilted her head, then nodded in a sharp way. I could not hear them, but I did not need to. My screen blinked as a new notification popped up in the corner. It was a shared calendar item I was not supposed to see, just a brief preview from an open permissions chain. The words were short but clear. It said my name, then the word termination, then effective Friday. I drove home on autopilot that evening, the same route I have taken for years, past half-finished overpasses and orange cones that our own crews had set. When you work in construction, even in payroll, you start seeing every lane, closure as hours, and overtime and meal breaks. You see numbers overlaying the world like a second skin. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky was already turning dark. The kitchen light was on, and Mia's backpack was on the table. She sat there with a textbook open, but her eyes were on her phone. She looked up when I came in and asked how work was. I said it was busy, like always. She heard my voice and understood more than the words. She has my wife's eyes, but my way of listening to tone instead of answers. I sat down at the table with her and asked about school, about a test she had coming. We talked about little things at first. Then she asked why I smelled like hotel coffee. I told her there had been an event, some panel about innovation. I said they talked about breaking old systems and how the new people would fix everything. I kept my tone light, but she studied my face. She asked if they were talking about me. I said they did not use my name, just talked about legacy bottlenecks and tribal knowledge. She frowned and said that it sounded like they meant me because nobody else she knew went in early to fix other people's mistakes and stayed late without extra pay. I smiled at that, but it felt thin. After she went back to her room, I stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a long minute, just listening to the quiet of the house. Then I walked through to the garage and flipped on the single bulb. My home office sits along the back wall. An old metal desk, a cheap office chair, and 2 stacked filing cabinets I got from a closing company. On the desk is the mirror drive for my system. The garage is cold, but it is mine. This is where I built the thing they now call a problem. Years ago, after my back injury, I sat in this chair with an ice pack and a laptop, trying to figure out how to stay useful. The company did not have a spot for a broken electrician, but they did have piles of messy timesheets and constant headaches with union rules. Back then, the payroll software the company used was half set up, full of missing codes and wrong tax rates. People were always calling to say their checks were wrong. Mark, who was a director at the time, said that if I could make sense of the job codes, he could get me a desk in payroll. I took it because I had a family and a mortgage and not many other options. Nobody offered me training, so I gave it to myself. I called union halls, asked dumb questions, read contracts late at night. I learned which locals had travel pay, which ones had double time rules, which wanted separate remittance reports. I learned that one state counted drive, time one way, and the next state did it another way. Every time I found a rule, I wrote it down in a simple way in my own notes. At first, I kept those notes in a notebook, but quickly that was not enough. So I started building a small system on my own time. I used simple tools, nothing fancy, but I tied each job number to a union local, a state, and a set of rules. When a timesheet came in from a crew in that job, the system knew which overtime rules to check against. It was not pretty. There were no modern graphs, no smooth user interface. It did not need to be. It needed to be right. We started seeing fewer angry calls. Audits stopped being terrifying. Checks came out steady. There were still errors, but fewer, and they were caught sooner. Mark came by my desk one evening when the floor was almost empty and told me quietly that I had saved them from a big fight with a city inspector. He said there was no budget for a raise, but that he appreciated me. The next year, during a safety and teamwork event at a cheaper hotel than today's ballroom, they handed me a small plaque for outstanding support. My last name was spelled wrong. My daughter was still small then, and she was so proud when I brought it home. We hung it in the hallway. My wife at the time said that at least they had noticed me. I told her that the plaque did not change my paycheck or my job title, but I smiled anyway. Over time, the thanks grew more private and the demands more public. People stopped seeing my long evenings and early mornings. They only saw that payroll worked. When it did not, they said it was my fault. When it did, they said nothing. That pattern became normal in a quiet way. There were other panels over the years, like the one earlier that day. I remember one from maybe 3 years back, another hotel ballroom. That time, Mark talked about our company's strong record with union partners and said it was because we have solid systems in place. I was standing near the coffee table. A general contractor I knew clapped my back and said he knew who those systems were. I laughed and said I was just doing my job. It was a joke that felt less funny every year. Each time someone used the word system, I imagined my gray box under the desk and my late nights in this garage. But system sounds better in speeches than Dan. Not all the reminders of my role came from work. A couple of years ago, I picked Mia up from school one day when my truck was in the shop. We rode the bus home together, something we had not done since she was little. In the high school parking lot earlier, she asked why I was always checking my phone. I told her that sometimes a foreman needed urgent help with a crew's pay. She asked if they paid me extra for answering calls at night. I said no, it was just important to keep things running. She said that it sounded like I was the one person holding a lot of weight. She asked what would happen if I did not answer someday. I said someone else would figure it out. She gave me a look like she did not believe me. Those small moments build into a picture over time. You do not see it clearly until someone tries to erase you from it. That night in the garage, after the panel with Taylor, I sat at my desk and woke the gray box. The mirror drive light flickered. I looked at the folders lined up on the screen with dates and project names. 8 years of patches, notes, and adjustments. Every time a union changed a rate, every time a state updated a tax rule, I had added to this structure. Nobody had paid me extra for that. The company had given me a salary and told me I was lucky to have a desk job after an injury. That phrase had been used on me more than once. It was a quiet way of saying I should not complain because things could be worse. As I clicked through the folders, I thought about the early meetings with Mark when he actually listened. Back then, he sat beside my desk and asked me to walk him through a complicated job. He said he did not understand how I tracked so many locals at once. I explained the simple steps. He nodded and said that is why they needed me. Over time, the tone shifted. From "we need you," it moved to "do we rely on you too much?" Then each time something went wrong somewhere else in the company, someone floated the idea of cross-training people to cover payroll. That never happened because cross-training takes time and patience, and both cost money. So they stayed with the one man in the corner who fixed things. Then Taylor arrived. Suddenly cross-training became streamlining. Suddenly I was not a man with hard-won knowledge, just a risk that needed to be removed. I leaned back and rubbed my lower back out of habit. The old injury never fully left. It was a dull reminder that people once saw me as strong in a different way, standing on rebar in the cold. A lot of the guys whose hours I tracked now still see me that way. When I visit a site trailer, they joke that I went soft in the office, but they also lower their voice to ask if their pension hours look right. They trust me more than they trust the company. It is an odd place to live, between workers and executives, needed by both and truly owned by neither. That middle space is easy to ignore until it disappears. A message pinged on my phone, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was from one of the foremen, a picture of his crew holding up their checks after a long storm week. He wrote that they got paid right, even on the emergency call-outs, and thanked me for having their backs. I stared at that message for a while. Then I thought about the slide in the ballroom where Taylor had talked about one person in a corner. I wondered how she would explain to these men that their pay was just an Excel problem any analyst could solve. I wondered if she had ever stood in a muddy lot at 4 a.m. while someone worried about a missed check. I doubted it. Before going back inside, I opened one of the bottom drawers of my filing cabinet. In it, under stacks of old audit letters and rate sheets, was a plain cardboard file box. Inside were the original papers from when I set up my small LLC years ago. The company had wanted a formal arrangement to use the system I built, so I formed a simple one-man company and signed a service agreement. At the time, it felt like a formality. I was just trying to protect myself and make things clear. I flipped through the pages, not yet reading every line, just looking at my name on the letterhead and the company's logo on the other side. I saw dates, renewal terms, and words like exclusive and proprietary. My own signature sat at the bottom in my old curling handwriting. I closed the box without letting my mind go too far down that road. Not yet. I knew that contract was real, but at that point it was only a shape at the edge of my thoughts. What was clear already was the pattern. For 8 years, my job had been to keep people calm and paid. For 8 years, I had taken calls at bad hours, fixed mistakes I did not make, and absorbed blame so others could keep their image clean. In return, I had a steady paycheck, a seat on the edge of the office, and the label of legacy hanging over my head. Now a niece with a shiny degree had arrived and told the room that anyone smart could push my buttons. When you lay it out in plain words, it does not sound like respect. It sounds like a long path toward the moment when someone finally says you are no longer needed. The next morning, when I walked into the office, the role alignment meeting still sat on my calendar. People moved around me with the same usual small talk. Janice glanced over with a worried look she tried to hide. Mark's door was closed. Taylor walked past my desk with her tablet, talking loudly about a plan to merge payroll and analytics. She said to someone that she wanted everything simple enough that, if our guy in the corner disappeared, nothing would change. The words floated over the cubicles and landed on my desk like a small stone. I did not say anything, but inside, another quiet label clicked into place. The morning of the meeting, the office felt slightly off, like the air was thicker even though nothing looked different. People still carried coffee cups and laughed about traffic, printers still hummed, and the old fluorescent lights still flickered in the far corner. But every time someone walked past my desk, I caught the way their eyes slid away a little too fast. The role alignment invite sat on my screen like a small stone in the middle of clear water. I kept working. There was still a batch to review, and one crew in State C had mixed job codes in their timesheets. I fixed their entries, reran the export, and sent the updated file. Even on a morning when I knew something was coming, the math still had to be right. At 9:30, Mark's assistant popped her head over the cubicle wall and said the meeting would be in the small HR conference room instead of Mark's office. She used that careful tone people use when they bring a dog to the vet. Janice looked up from her workstation when she heard the location. Her lips pressed together and her fingers paused on the keyboard. She asked in a low voice if everything was okay. I said I would know soon. She said they had been whispering a lot upstairs since the panel yesterday, and that Taylor had asked for access to parts of my system she had never used before. I told her to keep doing her job and not get drawn into rumors. I sounded calmer than I felt. The small HR room was down the hall near the copy center. It had a round table, 3 chairs, and no window. When I walked in, Mark was already there, sitting stiffly with his hands folded. An HR woman named Paula sat next to him with a neat stack of papers and a pen placed perfectly on top. She gave me a gentle smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes. Mark said they would get right to the point so they did not waste my time. He said the company was restructuring back-office functions and moving toward a more integrated model. He used words like synergy, efficiency, and modernization. He said my role, as it was defined, no longer fit the new plan. If someone wrote down those words, they would sound almost kind. But when you sit in that room, you hear what they really mean. They mean that a decision was made somewhere else, on a floor I do not sit on, and now my chair is no longer needed. Mark said the change was not about performance. He said my work had been valued and that nobody doubted my dedication. He said the problem was the risk of relying on one person for so much knowledge. He said the solution was to centralize everything under a new approach led by Taylor. He did not say she was his niece, but we all knew. Paula slid the stack of papers toward me. She said this was a standard separation package. She said they were offering a set number of weeks of pay and a short period of continued health coverage. She said all I needed to do was sign today. The top page listed a date. It said my employment would end on Friday, 2 days from now. Below that were paragraphs in dense language. I read slowly. There were sections where I agreed not to sue, not to speak badly of the company, and not to share confidential information. There were lines about returning property and not using trade secrets. I looked for something else. I did not see any reference to my small LLC, the one that had signed an agreement to provide the payroll system. I did not see any mention of a license or a separate service contract. I asked in a calm voice if this package covered everything between me and the company. Paula nodded and said yes, this would wrap things up neatly. I asked if legal had reviewed the service agreement I signed years ago when my system was brought in. She frowned for a second, then asked what I meant. I reminded them that the company had set up a separate contract with my LLC for use of the payroll tool. Mark blinked and said he thought that had all been folded into the general arrangement. Paula said legal had not flagged any special agreements. I did not argue. I simply said that I would need to review this at home before signing. Paula's smile grew tight. She said this was time-sensitive. I said I understood, but I also understood my right to read what I was signing. A few minutes later, Taylor opened the door without knocking and stepped in as if she had just been passing by. She leaned on the frame and asked in a bright tone how things were going. Paula stayed quiet. Mark said they had explained the new structure. Taylor said she was excited to work with me during the handoff, and that she would need me to write down the key steps of my process so she could load them into her model. She spoke like the decision was done, and everything else was just cleaning up. She said she knew this could be emotional for legacy team members, but that I should see it as a chance to free myself from doing things the old way. She asked if I could stay reachable for a while after Friday, just in case there were little questions. She said maybe we could hop on calls during the first couple of payroll cycles while she got comfortable. She did not offer payment for that time. She did not ask if I had other plans. She assumed I would want to help, the same way I had always helped. I told her I would finish my tasks through my last day and return all company property. I said any further support would have to be discussed in writing, through proper channels. Her eyebrows rose just a little. She said she hoped I would not make things harder than they needed to be. I said I had always kept things running and that I would follow the agreements as written. Mark shifted in his chair at that phrase. The meeting ended with the usual formalities. Paula thanked me for my years of service. Mark said he was personally grateful and that this was just the way things go sometimes. We shook hands. When I stepped out into the hallway, the sounds of printers and phones felt suddenly louder. I went back to my desk, carrying the severance packet in a plain folder. Janice looked up and saw my face. She stood, walked over, and asked quietly if they had done what she thought they had done. I said yes, my last day would be Friday. Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. She said she did not understand how they could get rid of the one person who knew how everything fit together. I said systems should not rely on one person, and that this was the story they were telling. Word travels fast in an office, especially when people pretend it does not. A few coworkers stopped by to say it was unfair. One or two barely made eye contact and mumbled that they were sure I would land on my feet. The IT guy came to my desk with a checklist and asked when he should schedule the removal of my access. I told him to follow whatever date HR had given him. He checked his tablet and said Monday at 8 in the morning, right before the next payroll run. I repeated the time in my head. Monday at 8. That meant they had 2 business days to move a system I had tuned for 8 years into something new. Or at least they believed they did. I spent the rest of the day finishing the tasks I could. I cleaned up my inbox, forwarded a few important chains to a shared folder, and wrote simple notes for Janice about certain recurring issues. I did not leave traps or delete anything they had a right to keep. That is not who I am, and I also know that sabotaging systems only hurts the workers in the field. My anger was not for them. It was for the people upstairs who saw them as lines on a chart. When 5 o'clock came, I shut down my computer and cleared my few personal items into a box. A photo of Mia, a coffee mug from a job site barbecue, the plaque with my misspelled name. On my way home, I stopped at the Union Hall to drop off a packet of remittance reports and a set of backup summaries I had promised to bring earlier in the week. The lobby was warm and crowded, with posters about safety on the walls and a stack of newsletters on a table. Luis, the business agent, spotted me and waved me over. He is a big man with a gentle voice, the kind of person who can calm a room without raising his own. He asked how things were at the company. I hesitated for a second. Then I told him the truth. I said my role was being eliminated and that Friday would be my last day. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said that was a big mistake on their part. He said the guys trusted me to get their checks right and that if payroll started falling apart, there would be a lot of angry people. He reminded me that union contracts do not play around with late pay or missing benefits. He said, in a slow, careful way, that if the company ever failed to pay correctly, the halls would not just shrug and move on. They would file complaints, call labor boards, and walk off jobs. I nodded. I knew all that, but hearing it out loud was different. It added weight. Luis asked who would handle things after I left. I said they had a new manager with fresh ideas. He raised an eyebrow and asked if she had ever sat down with him to talk through the contract details. I said as far as I knew, she had not. He shook his head and said they were playing with fire. Then he looked at me and asked if there was any chance I would be staying on as a consultant. I said at that point there was no such arrangement. He patted my shoulder and said that if things went sideways, people would remember who used to keep the machine running. He said he hoped management understood what would happen if checks did not come through. When I got home, Mia sat on the couch with her laptop. She closed it when she saw my face. I put the box from my desk on the coffee table. She stared at it, then at me. I told her they had decided to let me go because they wanted a new way to run payroll. I kept the language simple. She asked if I had done something wrong. I said no, that my work had been fine, but they wanted a different image and a younger leader. She said it did not sound fair. I said fairness was not always part of business talks. She asked what we would do about money. I said we had some savings, a small severance, and time to figure things out. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if I was going to help them if they called after I left. That question sat between us like another object on the table. For years, when the company panicked, I picked up the phone. When someone forgot a deadline or made a mistake, they turned to me and expected me to fix it. I had always said yes. I told Mia that I would need to think about that now. I said there is a difference between being loyal and letting people use you. She nodded slowly. She said she hoped I would do what felt right for me this time, not just for them. Later that night, back in the garage, I set the severance packet on the desk next to the file box from my LLC. I did not open either right away. I just sat and listened to the small sounds of the house through the thin door, the hum of the fridge, the creak of floorboards. My life for the last 8 years had been built around keeping things smooth for everyone else. Now there was a crack in that surface. I lifted the top page of the severance papers again and scanned the dense language. No mention of the separate service agreement. No mention of my ownership of the tool that kept everything integrated. I set the papers down and pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened the calendar app and created a new reminder. I set it for Monday morning at 8, the exact time IT would cut my access. In the subject line, I wrote simple words only I would fully understand. It was something like, System Obligations End. I saved it and watched the little colored dot appear on the date. On the desk beside me, the external hard drive's light blinked on and off, steady, patient, not caring who respected it or who took it for granted. For the first time, I felt a calm, cold line inside me, separating what I had done out of loyalty in the past from what I would do now, by the letter of each agreement and nothing more. The next morning, I woke up with a strange kind of calm. Not peace, not yet, but a clear center. The fear about losing my job was still there, but it sat behind something harder. I made coffee, packed my lunch out of habit, then stopped and put the container back in the fridge. Old routines die slowly, but they die. I put on a clean shirt and grabbed the folder with the severance papers and the file box from my LLC. I did not go straight to the office. Instead, I drove across town to a low brick building with a small gold sign, the law office where my sister's friend Kat worked. I had met Kat once at a family barbecue years ago. She had said if I ever needed help with contracts or employment stuff, I could call. Back then, I thought I would never need that kind of help. Now I sat in her waiting room holding 2 different versions of my last 8 years in my hands. The receptionist took my name and said Kat would be out soon. When Kat came, she looked exactly as I remembered. Calm eyes, steady movements, no wasted words. We went into her office, which smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Shelves lined the walls with binders and boxes. I told her what had happened, from the panel in the hotel ballroom to the small conference room with Paula and Mark and the stack of papers. I told her about Taylor, about the talk of legacy bottlenecks, and about the role alignment invite. I spoke slowly, watching her face as I went. She did not interrupt much. When I finished, I set the severance packet on her desk and then placed the cardboard file box beside it. I said I needed to know what these documents actually meant for me, not just what they wanted me to believe. She opened the severance packet first. She skimmed the main pages, then went back and read more carefully. She pointed out the sections where I would be giving up the right to sue, the part where I agreed not to say anything negative about the company, the clauses about confidentiality. She said this was standard, but that standard did not automatically mean good for you. Then she asked about the file box. I opened it and pulled out the service agreement between my LLC and the company, the one we had signed when they decided to use my system formally. She read that document more slowly. I watched her finger trace the lines. I saw her pause at certain phrases. She asked when this agreement had last been renewed. I told her it was on a rolling basis, linked to my employment, and that there were emails confirming each renewal. She asked if anyone from the company had ever sent me a notice ending or changing the service agreement. I said no, they had not. She asked if I had ever signed a new agreement that merged this contract into my general employment. I said no again. She leaned back and said, in a steady way, that the company had treated my system as if it were just part of the furniture over the years. But on paper, it was not. On paper, my LLC owned the tool and licensed its use to the company under certain terms. The agreement said I would provide access and support while the contract was active. It described how either party could end it. It also said that when the contract ended, I was not required to provide ongoing help unless a new agreement was signed. There was language about keys and access rights that stayed with my LLC. She compared that to the severance packet. She pointed out that the severance language did not mention the LLC or the service agreement at all. It only talked about my employment. She said that if I signed the severance as written, it might still leave the service contract in a strange place, or it might cause fights later over what I had given up. She advised that I should not sign anything until the company either acknowledged the separate contract or negotiated a clean way to end it. She also said I was under no legal duty to give free support after my last day. If they wanted my help, they could offer a consulting agreement at a fair rate. Hearing that from a lawyer, out loud, settled something inside me. It was one thing to feel like I was being taken for granted. It was different to see that the paperwork, the thing management always says we must respect, actually gave me more power than I had ever used. Kat asked me what I wanted. I said I did not want to hurt the workers in the field. I said I did not want to play games with their paychecks. But I also said I was tired of handing out free rescues to people who would replace me as soon as I stopped bleeding for them. She nodded and said that if I stayed within the contract terms and the law, I did not need to feel guilty for other adults' choices. We talked about possible next steps. She suggested I keep copies of all relevant documents at home. The service agreement, key emails, and any notes showing the company knew about the separate contract. She said if the company pushed me to sign in a hurry, I could simply state that I needed written clarification about how the service agreement would be handled. She also suggested I start writing down dates and events while they were fresh in my mind. Memory fades, but a timeline stays sharp. I thanked her, gathered the papers back into the box, and left feeling strangely more solid. After the law office, I drove to a bank branch where the company kept one of its payroll accounts. I had an appointment with a manager there, someone I knew from past meetings when we had to set up separate accounts for fringe benefits. We sat in a small glass cubicle. I asked him general questions about how signatory authority worked when an employee left. I did not badmouth the company, I just wanted facts. He said that when HR sent a termination notice, the bank would remove that person's ability to initiate transfers or approve batches. He said that once that update happened, I would no longer be able to move funds or fix payment runs on their behalf. I asked in a calm way what would happen if a company tried to say that a former employee should still be responsible for errors after their authority ended. He said that would be strange, because if my name was off the accounts and my access removed, I would not have the power to fix anything. He also said that from the bank's side, they would consider the company, not the former employee, responsible for managing their payroll correctly. That was all I needed to hear. I thanked him, shook his hand, and left. Another small piece slid into place. In the afternoon, I went back to the office. I could feel the shift as soon as I stepped onto the floor. The air held a mix of curiosity and unease. Taylor was standing at Janice's desk, pointing at her screen and talking fast. When she saw me, she smiled in that bright, professional way. She said she had already restructured the main payroll files and started building a new Excel model. She said she would need my help mapping my old logic into her new design. I told her I had just met with a lawyer to understand my agreements and that I would finish my work through Friday as promised. I said any mapping beyond basic handover notes would need a formal consulting arrangement. Her smile cooled. She said she had assumed we were on the same team. I said teams respect roles and contracts. A couple of people nearby pretended not to listen, which always means they were listening very hard. Janice looked at me with a mixture of fear and relief, as if someone had finally spoken a sentence she had been holding in her throat for days. Taylor walked away, typing on her tablet, clearly unhappy. I sat down at my desk and opened my email. There were several new messages from HR, asking nicely if I had had time to sign the severance documents. I replied that I was reviewing them with counsel and would respond once we had clarified the status of my LLC service agreement. I kept the tone polite but firm. I did not explain more than needed. That evening, instead of going straight home, I stopped at the small cafe near the industrial park. Janice had asked if we could talk somewhere away from the office. She arrived a few minutes after me, still in her work badge, with tired eyes. We sat in a corner booth with 2 cheap coffees between us. She said that since the panel, the mood in upper management had changed. People were excited about modernizing payroll. They talked about reducing headcount and cutting process fat. She said Taylor had already deleted some of the custom views in my system because she thought they were ugly and confusing. Janice said she was scared, not just for her job, but for the workers. She said she had tried to explain to Taylor that each local had its own rules and that the colors on a spreadsheet did not change those rules. She said Taylor brushed her off and said the software would handle it if they just set the formulas right. Janice told me she had been asked to help document what I did. She said she would do her best, but that she knew it took me years to build this. She asked if I was going to disappear after Friday. I told her I was not going to vanish from the world, but that my time of quietly saving management from their own choices was ending. I said I would not break any laws or harm the workers, but I would not step in for free if they ignored every warning. She nodded slowly, tears shining in her eyes, but not falling. She said she hoped I found a place that saw my work for what it was. She also said that, if things blew up, people on the floor would know it was not because I stopped caring. I told her that the records would show what had been warned and when. We finished our coffees in silence. When she left, she squeezed my shoulder in a way that said more than words. Back in my garage that night, I did what Kat had suggested. I started building a simple timeline. I opened a fresh document and wrote out key dates. The day I signed the service agreement, the renewals, the major audits we had passed, the panel at the hotel, the role alignment invite, the termination meeting. I added short notes under each one, nothing emotional, just facts. I printed the timeline and filed a copy in the cardboard box with the contracts. Then I opened my email at home and backed up selected threads to an external drive. Messages where I had explained union rules to managers, warnings about the risks of centralizing everything without training, confirmations of my system's role in audits. I did not doctor anything. I did not add comments. I simply kept copies. People think strength is about shouting or slamming doors. Sometimes strength is writing dates in a neat list and placing them in a folder. It is a way of saying to yourself, and later to others, that things did not happen by accident. They followed choices. The next day, an email came from a different direction. It was from a general contractor's CFO I had met a few times. He had heard through the usual grapevine that I was leaving. He said they were worried because they had big crews on our projects and had never had a serious payroll issue while I was there. He asked if I would be open to talking with someone at another firm who was interested in hiring a payroll expert with union experience. I read the message twice. Then I replied that I was open to a conversation as long as we respected all legal boundaries. It felt like a small door opening just as a larger one was closing. Before bed, I checked my phone out of habit. The reminder for Monday at 8 still sat on the calendar, a small colored dot on the screen. I was not sure yet what that morning would look like, only that a line would be crossed at that time. As I set the phone down on the desk, another notification appeared. It was a new email from Luis. The subject line was short. It asked if rumors were true that payroll was changing hands and suggested we should maybe sit down with everyone before things got messy. Friday started with a strange mix of normal noise and quiet endings. I walked into the office carrying my usual coffee, and the guard at the front desk greeted me like any other day. He did not know yet that this was supposed to be my last one. On the open floor, people were already at their computers. The big overhead lights hummed, the printers clicked, and someone's radio played low in the distance. If you did not look at the calendar, you would think nothing special was happening. For me, every little sound felt a bit sharper. I sat down at my desk and logged in one more time. The first thing I did was check the pending payroll queues. There were still time entries flowing in from the sites, corrections from supervisors, and small changes that had to be handled before the weekend. I went through them with the same care I always used. A crew in State B had a missing midday break entry that would have triggered a penalty if I left it, so I fixed it. Another project had overtime miscoded, so I corrected that too. I told myself that these were tasks I could still own until the clock ran out. I was not going to punish the workers because of what was happening upstairs. When the urgent items were cleared, I sent a quiet summary to Janice, outlining what was still open and what would roll into Monday. Around mid-morning, Paula from HR came by my desk instead of sending another email. She asked if I had had time to review the severance documents. I said I had met with counsel and that there were still questions about how my separate service agreement was being treated. She suggested we could park the contract issue for later and just get my signature on the main packet now. I said I was not comfortable signing anything that did not line up with all of my agreements. I kept my tone polite, not hostile. Her smile tightened, and she said legal would take a look and get back to me. She did not seem happy that I had taken that part seriously. A little later, Mark called me into his office. This time it was not with Paula, just the two of us. He stood by the window, looking out over the parking lot, the way people do when they want to sound calm and important. He said he had heard I was talking to lawyers. He said he hoped we could keep things friendly and not make a big deal out of technicalities. He said the company appreciated my service and that this was just about the future direction. I listened, then told him in a steady voice that I was simply making sure I honored the agreements we both signed. I said I would fulfill my duties through my last day, and after that, I would act according to the contracts. He did not like the word contracts coming from me. He said something about not wanting to burn bridges, then let me go. By lunchtime, the mood on the floor had shifted. More people knew it was my last day. Some stopped to say they were sorry. One of the younger analysts said he had always thought I made things look easier than they were. Janice brought me a coffee and set it on my desk without a word. Later, she asked if I wanted to grab some food, but I told her I had errands after work. The truth was I needed a little space. She nodded and went back to her station. Across the room, Taylor held an informal meeting at a whiteboard describing her new model. She drew boxes and arrows and wrote short phrases that sounded clean and simple. She said she wanted no more surprises next week. I thought about the calendar reminder on my phone and the time on the IT schedule. Before leaving for the day, I did something that felt small but important. I wrote a short, clear handover note and saved it in a shared folder where Janice and the team could see it. In it, I listed the basic steps for the regular payroll run, the reports that had to be generated for each state, and the general timing of tasks. I did not include all the detailed workarounds I had built over the years. I did not hide them out of spite. I simply remembered that I was no longer paid to carry the whole system on my back. Someone else had taken that responsibility now. When 5 o'clock came, I logged out for the last time, handed my key card to IT, and walked out with a small box under my arm. There were no speeches, no farewell cake. Just a few quiet nods and one quick hug from Janice near the elevator. On the way home, I stopped by the union hall again. It felt like I needed to talk to someone who saw the people at the end of the paycheck, not just the charts. The lobby was less crowded than before. Luis sat at his desk going through a stack of forms. When he saw me, he waved me into his small office. I told him that today had been my final day on the company's payroll. I told him my access to the system would end on Monday morning, right before the next run. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded on his stomach, and listened without interrupting. Then he said this changed things for the unions. He said our past good track record had been built on someone who understood the rules and cared about getting them right. He asked if the new manager had reached out to him. I said, as far as I knew, she had not. He shook his head slowly. He said that if Monday's checks were wrong or missing, the company would face more than a few angry phone calls. There would be formal grievances, possible work stoppages, and complaints to labor boards. I nodded and said I understood. He then asked carefully if I planned to show up anywhere near the payroll process after Monday. I said I would not be inside their system and I would not interfere. I said if people wanted to understand what had happened, I would have my records and memories, but I would not be standing in their office fixing mistakes for free. He considered that, then said he respected it. He also said that if things did blow up, the hall might call a meeting and invite me to sit in as someone who could explain what the system used to look like. That idea hung between us. I said if such a meeting happened and if it was done properly, I would come and tell the truth. He nodded and said that was all he asked. When I left the hall, the late sun was low in the sky, and the parking lot smelled like warm asphalt. I drove home feeling like I had taken a step away from my old life, but not away from the workers themselves. There is a difference between abandoning people and refusing to be a crutch for the ones who steer the ship. That evening in the kitchen, Mia and I sat at the table with open takeout boxes between us. She asked how my last day had gone. I said it had been quiet, with some goodbyes and some cold shoulders. I told her I had met with a lawyer, visited the bank, and spoken with Luis again. She listened with a serious face, more adult than I sometimes wanted to admit. She asked if I was angry. I said yes, but not in a shouting way. I said it felt more like a clear line inside, one that said I would no longer let people treat my work as invisible and my time as endless. She said she was proud of me for standing up for myself. That landed deeper than any plaque I had ever been given. On Saturday morning, my phone buzzed many times. Most messages were from numbers I knew, coworkers checking in, a foreman asking if rumors about my last day were true, an old contact from another company offering to connect me with someone hiring. I answered the ones that came from people on the ground. I told them simply that I was no longer with the company and that their new manager would be handling things. I did not badmouth anyone. When one foreman said he was worried about Monday, I told him to keep his time cards clean and let his union know if checks were wrong. He said they trusted me more than anyone upstairs. I thanked him and said that trust meant a lot. Later that afternoon, I met with the CFO from the other firm at a quiet cafe. His name was Elliot, and he came in wearing a plain shirt and no tie, which told me he was serious about listening. We sat at a small table near the window. He said he had heard from mutual contacts that I was leaving and that I had kept payroll running smoothly under complicated conditions for years. He asked me to walk him through the basics of what I had built, in broad terms. I talked about union locals, state rules, and the way my system linked job codes to contracts so the numbers matched reality. I did not share any confidential company information. I spoke about skills, not secrets. Elliot said that his firm had been looking to strengthen their own payroll operation, especially with more union work coming. He said they wanted someone who respected both the numbers and the people behind them. He asked if I would be open to joining them in a role focused on payroll compliance and maybe even building a service that could support other contractors too. I told him I was interested, but I needed to stay on the right side of every line. I said I would not move any data or tools that were truly owned by my old employer. I also said I had my own small company and experience with building systems from scratch. He nodded and said that was exactly the kind of independent thinking they were looking for. We agreed to talk again early next week, after the dust from Monday settled. On Sunday, the house felt calmer than it had in days. I did small chores, fixed a loose door handle, and tried to rest. But the thought of Monday hovered in the back of my mind. Somewhere in the office, Taylor was probably finalizing her spreadsheets, trusting that the formulas would hold. Somewhere in the server room, IT had a task scheduled to switch off my access. I thought about how often I had kept things from breaking at the last minute. I wondered how loud the alarms would be if nobody stepped in this time. In the afternoon, I went back out to the garage. I opened the cardboard box, checked that my copies of key papers and my timeline were still there, and closed it again. I did not need to read them. Just knowing they sat ready calmed me. That night, Mia knocked on the doorframe of the garage and asked if I was okay. I said I was thinking about tomorrow. She said she knew the workers might suffer at first, but that maybe people would finally see how much I had been doing all along. I told her I hoped the damage would be small and quick, not deep and lasting. I also told her that sometimes people only respect what they cannot replace. She rested her head against my shoulder for a moment and then went back inside. I turned off the light and followed. Monday morning, I woke before the alarm. The sky outside was still gray. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, phone face down beside the mug. For the first time in 8 years, I did not have to be at my desk at dawn. At 7:30, I flipped the phone over. The little colored dot on my calendar reminder sat on today. It marked the time when my access would end. As the minutes ticked toward 8, the phone began to buzz. First, it was a call from a company number. I let it ring out. Then another. Then messages started appearing, one after another, from coworkers and numbers I did not recognize. Some said there were problems with the run. Some said the system would not behave the way they expected. I did not answer. 2 minutes after 8, a new message popped up from Luis. There were no extra words, just a short line saying things had gone bad and that the hall was calling an emergency meeting. He said I might want to come down and hear what was being said. As I stared at the screen, my phone vibrated with another incoming call from Mark at the same time. The kitchen felt very quiet around me, except for the small sound of my coffee cooling on the table. I let Mark's call go to voicemail and grabbed my jacket and the cardboard file box from the garage. The drive to the Union Hall felt shorter than usual, maybe because my mind was already there. When I walked into the lobby, I could hear raised voices coming from the main conference room. Luis stood near the door, talking to a group of foremen. He saw me and motioned me inside. The conference room was packed. At one end of the long table sat Mark, pale and tight around the mouth, with Paula beside him and a laptop open. Taylor sat on the other side, her tablet in front of her, eyes hard but unsure. Around them were union officers, several foremen, and 2 representatives from a big general contractor. Some workers stood along the wall, arms crossed. The room smelled like coffee and anger. Luis asked everyone to sit. He stated that hundreds of workers had either not been paid or had serious errors in their checks. He said the unions had already drafted grievances and were ready to file complaints with state labor boards. Mark tried to say there had been technical issues and that they were working on fixes. Taylor added that my legacy system had made the transition harder than expected. Several people looked at me then. I just set my box on the table and waited. Luis asked me to explain my role. I spoke slowly. I said I had run payroll operations for 8 years. I said I had been terminated effective Friday and that IT had removed my access at 8 that morning, as scheduled. I took out the service agreement from my box and slid copies across the table. I pointed out the clauses that tied my support to an active contract and the language that said all obligations ended when the company chose to end the relationship. I said there had been no new agreement. I also laid out brief copies of my emails, warning management about the risks of replacing the system without training, and a short timeline showing when I was given notice and when access was set to end. I reminded them that the bank had removed my authority from the payroll accounts. I said, in simple words, that once I was fired and my access cut, I could not create or fix any checks even if I wanted to. The GC reps then spoke. They said their crews were furious and that project delays and penalties would be charged back to the company. They mentioned that another firm had already approached them about handling payroll in a more professional way. They glanced at me when they said this, making it clear they knew I was that path. Luis turned back to Mark and stated that, effective immediately, the unions were pulling crews from the company's projects until every worker was correctly paid and late penalties addressed. He added that they would be reviewing future work with contractors who respected proper payroll operations. He said the unions trusted the people who had kept checks correct in the past, not the ones who had broken that trust now. Mark tried to shift blame back to me, saying I could have stayed to help. Luis cut that off and said the company had made a choice when they fired the one person who understood the system and refused to negotiate proper support. He said this was not my walkout, it was theirs. The room went quiet for a beat, then low conversation started again, full of anger, but now pointed in one direction. The meeting ended with no handshake. Union officers began drafting formal notices at the far end of the table. GC reps stepped aside with Luis and me to talk about next steps. Mark sat hunched over his laptop, Taylor staring at the documents in front of her, her color drained. When I stepped back into the lobby, the sound of workers talking and phones buzzing filled the space. Near the door was a small trash can. I took my old company badge from my wallet, studied it for a moment, then dropped it in. In my other pocket, my phone buzzed with a new message from Elliot asking if I was ready to come by. I pushed open the hall door and walked out into the bright air, leaving the noise of their crisis and the signed papers behind me.